The moment the lights dimmed on the Voice stage and a single spotlight illuminated an empty chair with a weathered acoustic guitar, something profound filled the air. Not because of any living performer waiting in the wings, but because of the weight of legend, of loss, and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones we can no longer hear, except in the recordings they left behind as their final gifts to the world. What nobody in that studio was prepared for was the emotional impact of witnessing Johnny Cash's final recorded performance. A video that had been kept private by his family until this moment, when they felt the world was ready to experience one last glimpse of the man in black at his most vulnerable and most human. Hidden in this tribute was not just the story of one man's final song, but a meditation on mortality, on the way great artists face the inevitable decline of their abilities, on the profound connection between performers and audiences that transcends even the limitations that age and illness impose on once mighty voices. Let me take you back to understand how this moment came to be, because Johnny's final recording represents not just the end of one legendary career, but a reminder of how music can preserve the essence of someone we've lost and keep their spirit alive in ways that nothing else can. Johnny Cash had been battling serious health issues for several years before his death in September. The man who had given the world songs that became part of the American identity, tales of redemption and regret, love and loss, faith and doubt, knew that his time was limited, and he had been working quietly on what he somehow understood would be his final musical statement. For over 5 decades, Johnny Cash had been more than just a country singer. He had been the voice of the downtrodden, the champion of the forgotten, the man who sang from prison yards and gave hope to those society had written off. His deep, resonant voice had carried the weight of authentic American storytelling, transforming simple melodies into profound statements about the human condition. The recording had been made in a small studio setup in Johnny's own cabin in Tennessee, just 2 months before his death. His voice, weakened by diabetes complications and the devastating grief of losing his beloved wife June Carter Cash earlier that year, had been captured performing one last version of the song that had defined his career and become his signature piece, a song about love's consuming power that had resonated with audiences for decades. Johnny had always said that Ring of Fire was more than just a song, it was a prophecy, a warning, and a celebration all wrapped into one. Written about the dangerous, all-consuming nature of falling in love with someone who changes everything about your life, it had become an anthem for anyone who had ever risked everything for love and found that the risk was worth it. But by 2003, Johnny was singing it with the weight of someone who had experienced not just the fire of love, but the devastating loss of watching that fire be extinguished by death. June's passing had left him broken in ways that went beyond grief. It had left him questioning whether he had the strength to continue without the woman who had been his musical partner, his spiritual anchor, his reason for believing that redemption was possible. The video showed Johnny, visibly frail but determined, sitting in his favorite chair with his acoustic guitar, surrounded by the memorabilia of a career that had spanned nearly 50 years. His hands, once steady on the fretboard, now trembled slightly. But his eyes still held the intensity of someone who had spent his life understanding that music was about truth, about sharing the depths of human experience through melody and verse. The walls of his cabin were covered with gold records, photographs with presidents and fellow musicians, and personal mementos that told the story of a life lived fully, if not always easily. There were pictures of him with June, images from his legendary performances at Folsom Prison and San Quentin, awards that recognized not just his commercial success, but his cultural impact on American music. Blake Shelton had been profoundly influenced by Johnny Cash throughout his career, often citing the Man in Black as one of the primary reasons he had pursued country music. Growing up in Oklahoma, Blake had learned Johnny's songs before he learned how to properly hold a guitar, absorbing the lessons about authenticity, about the power of storytelling, about the importance of remaining true to your roots, no matter how successful you became. When Johnny's family approached Blake about sharing this final recording on The Voice, Blake had been honored but also deeply concerned about whether he could maintain his composure while presenting something so personal and final. The Cash family had explained that Johnny had specifically requested that his final performance be shared not in a somber memorial setting, but in a place where young musicians could witness what it meant to remain an artist even when your abilities were failing, even when your body was giving up, even when your heart was broken beyond repair. Daddy wanted young singers to understand that being an artist doesn't end when you get old. Roseanne Cash had told Blake during their planning conversation. He wanted them to see that real musicians find ways to make music until their very last breath, that the songs matter more than the voice that carries them. Standing on the voice stage now, Blake felt the weight of Johnny's absence in ways that went beyond professional admiration. Johnny had been more than an influence. He had been a reminder of what country music could be at its finest. Honest, raw, uncompromising in its commitment to telling the truth about the human condition, unflinching in its examination of both the darkest and brightest aspects of the human experience. Blake had met Johnny only once, at a music industry event in Nashville, but that brief encounter had left an indelible impression. Johnny had been in the later stages of his illness, moving slowly and speaking softly, but when he talked about music, his eyes had lit up with the same fire that had made him legendary decades earlier. "Son," Johnny had said to Blake during that encounter, "remember that the audience doesn't care how technically perfect you are. They care whether you're telling them something true about what it means to be alive. Don't ever lose that. Don't ever let success make you forget that music is about connection, not just entertainment." "Tonight," Blake began, his voice already thick with emotion before the video had even started, "we're going to share something very special with you." Before Johnny Cash passed away in 2003, he recorded one final performance of his most famous song. His family has graciously allowed us to share this with you tonight, not as entertainment, but as a way of honoring one of the greatest voices in the history of American music. Blake paused, looking around the studio at the faces of young contestants and seasoned coaches alike, understanding that many of them might not fully appreciate what they were about to witness, might not understand the historical significance of the moment they were about to share. "For those of you who might not know Johnny Cash's full story," Blake continued, "you need to understand that you're about to meet someone who changed what country music could be. Johnny didn't just sing songs, he lived them, breathed them, made them matter in ways that went far beyond entertainment. He was the man in black, and he wore that color not as a fashion statement, but as a reminder of all the people who had been forgotten, overlooked, written off by society." Blake's voice grew stronger as he spoke about Johnny's legacy, about the prison concerts that had redefined what it meant to be a socially conscious artist, about the collaborations with producers like Rick Rubin that had introduced Johnny's music to entirely new generations, about the way Johnny had remained relevant and powerful even as his contemporaries faded into nostalgia. What you're about to see is Johnny Cash saying goodbye to his fans, to his music, to the life he'd built through songs that became part of all our lives. This isn't just a performance, it's a final gift from someone who understood that music is how we connect with each other across time, across pain, across the barrier between life and death. The large screen behind Blake lit up with the image of Johnny Cash in his final months, seated in his home studio, guitar in his weathered hands. Even in his diminished state, there was something commanding about his presence, something that reminded everyone watching why he had been able to hold audiences captive for 5 decades. He looked directly into the camera with eyes that held the weight of someone who had lived fully, loved deeply, struggled honestly, and was prepared to leave with dignity. His face showed the ravages of illness and grief, but also the peace of someone who had made his peace with mortality, who understood that his work on earth was complete. "Hello, friends." Johnny's recorded voice filled the studio, weaker than it had been in his prime but still carrying the unmistakable authority that had made him a legend. "If you're watching this, it means I've gone on ahead to meet June. But before I go, I wanted to sing for you one more time the song that brought us together all those years ago." Johnny's voice broke slightly as he mentioned June, and he paused for a moment, looking away from the camera as he composed himself. When he looked back, his eyes were filled with tears, but also with determination to complete what he had come to do. June always said that Ring of Fire was our song, Johnny continued, his voice growing steadier. She said it was about how love changes you, how it burns away everything you thought you knew about yourself, and leaves something better in its place. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how love really is like fire. It can destroy you, but it can also purify you, make you into someone you never thought you could be. Johnny began to play the opening chords of Ring of Fire, his fingers moving slowly but surely across the strings. Even with his diminished dexterity, muscle memory carried him through the chord progressions he had played thousands of times over the decades. When he started singing, his voice carried the weight of someone who truly understood every word, someone who had lived long enough to appreciate the profound truth contained in a simple song about love's transforming power. But as Johnny sang, something heartbreaking became evident to everyone watching. His voice, once rich and commanding, was now fragile, breaking occasionally in ways that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the physical reality of a body that was failing. He struggled with breath control, paused longer than usual between verses, and at one point had to stop entirely to compose himself. Love is a burning thing, and it makes a fiery ring. Johnny's voice cracked on the high notes that he had once hit effortlessly, and he grimaced slightly, frustrated by his instrument's betrayal. But he continued, determined to complete what he had started, refusing to let physical limitations prevent him from delivering his final message. "This old voice ain't what it used to be," Johnny said directly to the camera during a pause between verses, his vulnerability completely exposed. "I used to could hit every note without thinking about it, used to could sing for hours without getting winded. Now it takes everything I got just to get through one song." He attempted a slight smile, but the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. Here was a man who had defined himself through his voice, through his ability to communicate emotion and meaning through song, facing the reality that his primary tool was failing him when he needed it most. As Johnny attempted to continue, something extraordinary happened in the voice studio. Blake, standing at the edge of the stage watching the screen, began to cry openly, not the polite tears of professional emotion, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone witnessing a hero's struggle with mortality, someone understanding that all voices, even the greatest ones, eventually face the limitations that time imposes. Kelly Clarkson, herself a vocalist who understood the terror of voice problems, was crying harder than anyone in the studio. She understood what it meant to depend on your voice, not just for your career, but for your identity, for your way of connecting with the world. Watching Johnny struggle with his failing instrument was like watching a painter lose his sight, a writer lose his words. John Legend sat with his hand over his heart, tears streaming down his face, as he processed the profound humanity of what he was witnessing. As a songwriter and performer, he recognized the courage it took for Johnny to record this final performance, knowing that his voice was no longer capable of the power and control that had made him legendary. Niall Horan, the youngest coach, was learning something about artistry and mortality that no classroom could have taught him. He was witnessing what it meant to be an artist who refused to let physical limitations silence the music that still lived in his heart. The audience, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented, remained completely quiet, except for the sounds of people crying as they watched one of country music's greatest voices deliver his final performance. Many in the audience were older fans who had grown up with Johnny's music, who understood the full weight of what they were witnessing. On screen, Johnny's voice grew more strained as he continued, but also more determined. Despite the physical limitations, despite the obvious effort each note required, despite the breaks and pauses, there was something profoundly moving about hearing this legend refuse to let his voice be silenced. Without one final statement, "I fell into a burning ring of fire. I went down, 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 and the flames went higher." When Johnny reached the chorus, His voice gained momentary strength, as if the act of singing his most famous song was giving him energy, reminding him of why he had devoted his life to music in the first place. His eyes remained focused on the camera, creating an intimate connection with everyone watching, making each viewer feel as though Johnny was singing directly to them, sharing one final piece of wisdom about life, love, and the courage required to face whatever comes next. But the effort was clearly taking its toll. Between verses, Johnny had to pause to catch his breath, and his hands occasionally trembled on the guitar strings. At one point, he missed a chord change entirely and had to stop and restart, looking frustrated and embarrassed by his mistake. "I'm sorry," Johnny said to the camera during one of these pauses, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know y'all deserve better than this. I know you remember when I could really sing, when my voice was strong enough to carry any song I threw at it. I wish I could give you that one more time." The raw honesty of this moment was devastating to everyone watching. Here was Johnny Cash, the man in black, the legend who had never shown weakness or vulnerability in his public performances, admitting that he was no longer the performer he had once been. But then something beautiful happened. Johnny looked directly into the camera with renewed determination. "But you know what?" he said, his voice gaining strength from his conviction. "Maybe that's not what matters anymore. Maybe what matters is that the song still needs to be sung, even if the voice singing it isn't perfect anymore. Maybe what matters is that the love is still there, even if the way it's expressed has changed. And it burns, 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 the ring of fire, the ring of fire." As Johnny sang these final lines, his voice became even more deliberate, more weighted with meaning. Here was a man who knew he was saying goodbye, who was using his final breath to remind people that love, real love, is worth any pain it might bring, that the fire of true connection is what makes life meaningful, that some things are worth burning for. The cameras captured every nuance of Johnny's final performance, the way his weathered hands moved across the guitar strings, the way his eyes closed during particularly emotional passages, the way his body seemed to find strength from somewhere deep inside when the music demanded it. When the song ended, Johnny set his guitar aside, carefully, as if he understood that this might be the last time he would ever hold it in a recording session. He looked directly into the camera one final time, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the wisdom of a life fully lived. "June's waiting for me," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying across the years to touch everyone who would ever watch this recording. "And I'm ready to go. I've had a good run, made some good music, loved and been loved by the best woman who ever lived." Johnny paused, gathering his thoughts and his strength for his final message. "I want to thank y'all for letting me share my songs with you all these years," he continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. "Thank you for listening when I sang about pain, about redemption, about the hard truths that life teaches you. Thank you for understanding that music isn't just entertainment, it's how we share our souls with each other." "Keep the music alive," Johnny said, looking directly into the camera with the intensity that had made him legendary. "Keep love alive. Keep fighting for the people who don't have voices, for the forgotten ones, for those who need someone to sing their stories. And remember that sometimes the fire is worth the burn, sometimes love is worth any pain it might bring, and sometimes the most important songs are the hardest ones to sing." The screen faded to black, and the silence in the voice studio was absolute, profound, sacred. For several moments no one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe as they processed what they had just witnessed. Then Blake, still crying, began to speak, his voice breaking with emotion as he tried to find words adequate to honor what they had all just experienced. "Johnny Cash wasn't just a country music star," Blake said, his voice thick with tears. "He was the voice of anyone who's ever struggled with demons, anyone who's ever found redemption through love, anyone who's ever understood that the most powerful music comes from the darkest places and leads to the brightest light." Blake wiped his eyes and looked around the studio at the faces of everyone present. Contestants, coaches, crew members, audience members, all united in their shared recognition of having witnessed something sacred. What you just saw, Blake continued, was courage. Real courage. The courage to be vulnerable, to admit that you're not what you used to be, but to keep creating anyway. The courage to share your pain, your limitations, your humanity with the world, knowing that it might make you look weak but understanding that it actually makes you stronger. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Blake walked to the center of the stage and did something unprecedented. He began to sing Ring of Fire himself, not as a cover or a tribute performance, but as a prayer, a conversation with someone who was no longer there to respond, but whose influence continued to shape every note in country music. As Blake sang, his voice strong and clear but carrying the emotional weight of what they had all just witnessed, the other coaches quietly joined him, understanding that this wasn't about showcasing their own abilities, but about honoring someone whose voice had become part of the soundtrack of American life. Kelly's harmonies soared above Blake's melody, her voice breaking occasionally with emotion, but carrying forward with determination to honor Johnny's memory. John's piano skills, usually reserved for his own performances, found their way to an instrument that had been brought onto the stage, providing gentle accompaniment that supported rather than overwhelmed the vocals. Niall, despite being from a different musical tradition, found ways to add his voice to the tribute, understanding that music really is a universal language that transcends borders, genres, and generations. The audience began to sing along softly, creating a chorus of voices that seemed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, between memory and presence, between the pain of loss and the celebration of legacy. When they finished, the applause was unlike anything the voice had ever experienced. It wasn't appreciation for a performance. It was gratitude, love, recognition of a life that had given meaning to countless other lives through the power of honest, authentic music. Blake stood in the center of the stage, surrounded by his fellow coaches and the audience, all of them united in their shared loss and their shared appreciation for what Johnny Cash had given them throughout his career, and especially in this final vulnerable moment. Johnny Cash taught us that the best music doesn't just entertain, it tells the truth about what it means to be human, Blake said, his voice steady now, supported by the love and memories surrounding him. Tonight, through his final performance, Johnny reminded us one more time that facing our limitations with dignity is just as important as celebrating our strengths. He showed us how to say goodbye with grace, how to remain an artist even when your instrument is failing, how to find beauty in vulnerability. Blake looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to the television audience, but to the millions of people who had been touched by Johnny's music over the decades. If you're out there struggling with getting older, with losing abilities you once took for granted, with facing limitations you never expected, Johnny Cash just showed you how it's done. He showed you that your worth doesn't diminish when your abilities change, that there's beauty in imperfection, that sometimes the most powerful moments come when we stop pretending to be invincible and start sharing our humanity. The tribute became one of the most watched segments in The Voice history, shared millions of times across social media, not because it was technically perfect or dramatically staged, but because it captured something authentic about loss and the way great artists continue to teach us even after their voices have been silenced. The response was overwhelming. Blake received thousands of messages from viewers who had been moved by Johnny's final performance, who felt that they had been given a chance to say goodbye to someone whose music had been part of their lives for decades. Many wrote about how Johnny's final message, about love being worth the pain, about facing the end with dignity, about continuing to create even when your abilities are diminished, had helped them process their own losses, their own understanding of what it means to age with grace. Elderly viewers wrote about feeling seen and validated by Johnny's struggle with his failing voice, about understanding that they weren't alone in facing the limitations that age brings. Younger viewers wrote about gaining new appreciation for the vulnerability and courage required to continue creating as you age, about understanding that artistry isn't just about technical perfection, but about emotional truth. Musicians from across all genres reached out to share how Johnny's final performance had affected them, how it had reminded them why they had chosen music as their life's work, how it had reinforced their understanding that real artistry transcends technical ability and reaches into the realm of human connection. That night changed my understanding of what it means to honor someone's legacy. Blake said in interviews afterward, "Johnny didn't just leave us his recordings, he left us an example of how to face our limitations with honesty, how to use your final moment to give something beautiful to the world, how to say goodbye without giving up, how to remain an artist even when your instrument is failing." Blake found himself thinking about Johnny's example in his own career, understanding that he too would someday face the reality of a voice that couldn't do what it once could, that his own abilities would eventually be touched by time and age. But Johnny's final performance had shown him that there could be beauty in that vulnerability, wisdom in that acceptance, power in that honesty. Johnny Cash's final recording became more than just a tribute segment. It became a meditation on mortality, artistry, and the profound power of music to preserve not just someone's voice, but their wisdom, their courage, their essential humanity. The impact extended far beyond the immediate audience. The performance was studied in music schools as an example of how artistry can transcend technical limitations, how emotional truth can overcome physical constraints. It was shared in grief counseling sessions as an example of how to face loss with dignity and grace. Blake learned something that night that changed his approach to his own career, his own understanding of what it means to be a lasting artist. "Johnny taught me that the most important thing we can do as artists isn't to achieve perfection. It's to remain authentic, to keep telling the truth about the human experience, to understand that our voices are gifts that we're only borrowing for a while. Because sometimes the most powerful performances are the ones that remind us what we've lost and help us appreciate what we still have. Sometimes the most moving tributes are the ones that let legends speak for themselves one final time. And sometimes a final recording can teach everyone watching that the best songs aren't just about entertainment. They're about helping people understand how to love fully, live authentically, and face whatever comes next with the kind of dignity that only comes from a lifetime of singing the truth." Johnny Cash's final performance proved that true artists never really leave us. They become part of the wisdom we carry forward, part of the courage we find when we need it most, part of the love we share with others who need to hear that someone understands their struggles and celebrates their capacity to overcome them. The music continues, even when the musician has taken his final bow, because some voices are so true they become eternal, echoing in every heart that has ever been touched by authentic expression of the human experience. And sometimes, in their most vulnerable moments, these voices teach us the most important lessons of all, that it's not the strength of our instruments that matters, but the depth of our humanity, that real artistry comes from the courage to keep creating even when creating becomes difficult, and that the most beautiful songs are often the ones sung by voices that refuse to be silenced, even when they can no longer sing with the power they once possessed.